from complex scenes. Prior to beginning this role in 2019, she completed her undergraduate work in biomedical engineering, also at Johns Hopkins, her PhD in computational biology at MIT, and her postdoc at MIT's McGovern Institute and Harvard Medical School. Her work has recently been supported by a Google AI Faculty Research Award and has been published in prestigious journals including PNAS, eLife, and Nature Communications. Her talk today is titled The Neural Computations Underlying Human Social Interaction Recognition. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Isik.
Thank you so much, Erica, and thank you to all of the organizers for having me. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to highlight a charitable organization. So I chose the DC Abortion Fund, which is a nonprofit that works to secure abortions for pregnant people in or traveling to the DC area who can't afford the full cost of an abortion. One of the things I really like about the organization is that all of the caseworkers are volunteers, and so a large portion of the funding goes directly to helping patients. Okay, so switching gears to social interactions. So many of you have probably seen this image before, but even if you haven't, you can pretty quickly recognize what's happening and why it's funny. And in order to do that, you need to not just be able to recognize the people in the image, like Barack Obama, or the objects, like a bathroom scale, or the scene setting, a locker room. But instead, you have to have rich understandings of the physical world. So the fact that when Obama puts his foot on the scale, it registers as heavier. And people's mental states, the fact that this guy does not know Obama's foot is on the scale. And also understandings of other people's social interactions, right? So the fact that these people are all in on the joke together and the guy on the scale is not. And so a central question our lab seeks to address is to understand how do humans extract complex social information from visual input. If you think about it, this is a really hard problem. So this image alone inspired several long-form think pieces that were written about it. And you can compare humans' rich descriptions of this image to what state-of-the-art AI thinks about it. So in the last several decades, there have been huge strides made in artificial vision systems. And so in particular, I'm going to put this image into Google Vision's, they have an API with their latest deep learning methods that can do a bunch of things. So you upload the image, and the first thing I tried was to get all the objects in the image. And so this system can put bounding boxes around almost every single object and correctly classifies almost all of them. And so this is really impressive and highlights all the progress that has been made in visual object recognition over the last several decades. But these bounding boxes and object labels are a far cry from how humans would describe this image, right? And so in the last several years, there have also been some attempts to classify social information in images, but they've been very limited. And so Google's attempt to do this comes in trying to detect faces and recognize the emotional expressions on the faces. So that's not everything, but it's a start. And Google's system does a pretty good job of this, so you can see it correctly puts bounding boxes over all of the many faces. And we can highlight on the faces zoom in on the faces one at a time and see what it classifies them as. So this first face, which it calls face number 10, it tries to classify the expression as joy, sorrow, anger, surprise, etc. But it rates all of the expressions as equally very unlikely. Okay, we can try another one. So how about Barack Obama's face, which is face number 9? Again, every expression is rated as equally very unlikely. And in fact, the only face that Google's system feels has a confident prediction of is this one in the back, which it rates as being very likely to be blurred. And I think what this example illustrates is the huge gap between all the progress we've made in understanding visual object recognition and humans' rich visual social abilities. And so the approach we take in our lab is to try to apply the methods that have been successful in helping us understand visual object recognition to understand different aspects of social vision. And in particular, we use a combination of both high spatial resolution neuroimaging like fMRI and high temporal resolution neuroimaging like EEG and ECOG, behavior and computational modeling, and in particular, the combination and comparison of these different types of methods. And so today I'm going to talk to you about an fMRI study, a few fMRI studies, and then tell you about how the findings inspired a new computational model that we then compared to human behavior in a separate experiment. And this particular aspect of social vision that I'm going to focus on today and that our lab mostly focuses on is how we recognize other people's social interactions. And so in particular, I'm talking about third-party social interactions. So the interactions, for example, between Barack Obama and his staffers. And so this is a very important thing that humans do every day. And many of these abilities even develop very early in infancy. So at only a few months of age, infants can recognize others' social interactions and can, for example, tell apart helping interactions, like when one puppet is helping another one get up a hill, versus hindering interactions. These abilities are also shared in primates who can make similar judgments in these sorts of simple geometric displays. But until recently, very little was known about the neural computations that underlie this ability. So today I'm going to talk to you, like I said, first about a series of studies trying to understand the neural basis of these abilities, and then a second set of studies looking at the underlying computations. So to start, we know from decades of social neuroscience research that there are many brain regions involved in processing different types of social information about individuals. So in particular, there are many regions involved in perceiving faces, bodies, motion of individuals. And there's also the theory of mind network that's involved in recognizing and understanding other people's mental states. And so we wanted to know if recognizing a social interaction relies on any of these known visual social processing regions. So in the real world, social interactions are imbued with a lot of rich visual and contextual information. And so to start, we wanted to try to strip most of that away and reduce social interactions to their most minimal components, which we defined as two agents acting with some sort of temporal contiguity. So in a first experiment, we showed subjects videos of point-light figures either engaged in a social interaction, like I'm showing you here, and contrasted that with pairs of point-light figures acting independently. And so we showed people in an fMRI scanner a bunch of these different videos and asked, are there any brain regions that respond more to the videos on, like the ones on the top of the interaction versus the ones on the bottom? And so here are the results from a group random effects analysis. And what we find is that there's a region in the right hemisphere in the posterior STS that I'm circling here that seems to be selectively engaged when people watch interactions versus the independent actions. So this was a group analysis. We can also identify this region in individual subjects. So here are the results from one subject. I'm showing you the subject's social interaction, the most social interaction selective voxels in red. The voxels that respond most when doing mental state inference, shown in blue. The ones that respond most to faces in yellow, and most to motion in green. And so this is one of our subjects. Here are three more. And so you can see that there is some across-subject variability, but in general, the location of these regions is pretty stereotyped. And while the social interaction region is very nearby these other known regions, it seems to be anatomically distinct. And in results that I won't get into, we also show that this region has a distinct functional profile that's different from all of these other brain regions that had been previously classified. In the second experiment, we showed subjects animated shape videos like the kind used in those infant studies I showed you. So for example, where one shape was trying to achieve a goal and the second shape would either help it or hinder it. And we showed subjects several different versions of these videos. And we contrasted these different social scenes with scenes depicting physical interactions, where the shapes would move around like billiard balls in a similar visual scene, but were inanimate. And we found that this region in the pSTS could not only distinguish the social from the physical scenes, but could also categorize the helping versus hindering interactions. And so all in all, it seemed like there is a selective region in the pSTS that processes other people's social interactions, that can distinguish between helping and hindering interactions, and seems to be functionally distinct from nearby regions that code for faces, animacy, motion, theory of mind. And so this was exciting, and in particular, we thought it was nice that it generalized across two very different sets of stimuli. So point light figures and these animated shape videos. However, as you can probably tell, both of these videos are a very far cry from real world social interactions. The real world is much richer, right? Like the image I showed of Obama. And so we wanted to ask if the same type of neural selectivity exists even in more natural contexts. And the real world is actually even worse than this image I'm showing you, because often you're viewing temporally extended events. And so here's a scene from the BBC show Sherlock.
John Watson. Stamford. Mike Stamford, we were bots together.
Yes, sorry, yes. Hi, hello.
Right, and so there's a lot going on. Things are evolving over time. The interactions themselves are somewhat ambiguous. It's hard to really tell what's going on without context. And in particular, when you see this scene, you can not only tell that these people are engaged in a social interaction, but you also see their faces and you hear their voices. And you're thinking about their thoughts, right? Or engaging in theory of mind and also trying to process their language. And all of these things are happening at once, right? And so if we continue to study each of them in isolation, it's going to be really hard to get a good understanding of how these processes interact in the real world. And so in a more recent study, a former postdoc in my lab, Amy Lee Messon, asked if we could observe the same type of selectivity for social interactions in more natural settings. And so to address this, she took two publicly available movie data sets. So this was a pandemic project. One came from Janice Chen and colleagues and involved 17 adults watching the BBC show Sherlock. And the second came from Aliko and colleagues and involved subjects watching the romantic movie 500 Days of Summer. And we chose these two data sets because they came from different labs. The two movies were totally different genres, and so hopefully any findings we see would generalize across both of these settings and not be idiosyncratic to any one particular movie. And so, like I mentioned, in the real world, perceptual features and social affective features are all kind of co-occurring together. And in particular in Hollywood movies, these two things often are tightly coupled by design, right? And so to understand the contributions of different features, the first thing we did was densely annotate the movie with several visual features that we extracted automatically, like the pixel values, the motion energy, and then some things we had hand labeled, like whether the scene was taking place indoor or outdoors, whether there was a face on the screen or written words on the screen. And then finally, as a catch-all for high-level visual information, we took each frame and passed it through a deep neural network and took the output of a late-stage convolutional layer. We also extracted auditory features from the movie, amplitude and pitch, and whether or not background music was playing. And then finally, we had annotators hand label different social features So a binary feature saying whether or not there was a social interaction on the screen, a binary feature describing whether a character was speaking, whether a character was engaged in theory of mind, and different and affective features, the valence and arousal of each scene. So for example, that scene I showed you consists of a social interaction, character speaking, and it's on average rated as neutral. The DNN features look something like this. Here's the output of our face detection algorithm, auditory pitch, et cetera, et cetera. And so to understand each feature's contribution to brain activity, we learned an encoding model that related the activity, the time course in each voxel over the course of the movie to the different features. And so we just use linear regression to learn the weighting between each voxel and this set of features. And in particular, we used a type of regression called banded ridge regression, which deals well with correlated and high dimensional feature spaces. So we would train our algorithm on one subset of the movie, and then on held out movie data, with this, we can predict what the voxel activity should look like based on the features and the learned mapping. And then to get an accuracy of our model, we just correlate the true voxel activity with the predicted voxel activity. Okay. And so first we evaluated the model's encoding performance. And I'm just going to show you the results from Sherlock, but they look very similar in the summer data. And if you're interested, I'm happy to talk about those results later. Okay, and we also used a mask. So we, based on subjects, based on the inter-subject correlation across subjects. So we only tried to predict voxel responses in regions with significantly above chance ISC. And here are the results. So what we found is that we could predict voxel responses reliably above chance in every voxel in our mask, and activity was highest bilaterally in the STS. Okay, so that was reassuring. Next, though, we wanted to understand like I mentioned, the perceptual features are all covariant with the social affective features. So to understand the contribution of each, we did a variance partitioning analysis. And so to do this, we built 3 different encoding models: the full model with all the features that I just showed you, a model with just the perceptual features, and then a model with just the social features. And to calculate the unique variance of each of these groups, so for you can just subtract the other group's variance from the full model, variance explained by the full model. So in other words, to calculate the unique variance explained by perceptual features, you subtract the social variance explained from the full model's variance explained. You can also calculate the unique variance of an individual feature by comparing the full model to a full model with every single feature except your feature of interest. So for example, to look at the unique variance explained by social interactions, you would build a model with every feature except that one and subtract its variance explained from the full model. Okay. So to start with, we can look at the unique variance explained by the perceptual features in the movie. And what we see is that there's unique variance explained in auditory cortex and throughout visual cortex, which is a nice sanity check, right? And so then we can also look at the variance explained by the social affective features. And here are the results. So we see responses along the STS, in the theory of mind network, and also in more frontal action observation regions. And so we thought this was pretty exciting, the fact that even though these features are actually very tightly coupled during the movie, we can isolate their unique contributions. So in other words, we can dissociate the effect of the perceptual features from the social affective features in the movie. So what we really wanted to look at was the unique variance explained by social interactions and compare this to our another closely related social feature theory of mind. And so here are the results for social interactions. And what you can see is that you can explain unique variance to social interactions bilaterally along the STS And this is true even though we've extracted shared variance with highly correlated features like theory of mind, like a face on the screen, like speech, etc. And another thing that's nice is that it is consistent with our results in more controlled studies, the ones I just showed you, although the responses are more extensive in this natural movie. Okay, and then finally we looked at theory of mind, which is a difficult feature to label in the movie, so I do want to caveat that. But we do see responses throughout the theory of mind network, and importantly, although the variance explained is lower, but importantly, the regions seem to be almost entirely non-overlapping with the social interaction regions. So even though you're often watching a social interaction and thinking about characters' mental states, and watching the characters think about each other's mental states all at the same time, you can isolate these two processes in the movie. So we found that social interactive are selectively processed along the STS, but in particular along the posterior portion of the STS. And that's true even in natural stimuli when all of this information is co-varying with each other. So in the next part of my talk, I want to discuss the computational implications of this and try to address the question, like, why should I care about neural selectivity? What can this tell us about the underlying neural computations? So I showed you across multiple studies that social interactions are processed separately from the theory of mind network, which suggests that this does not rely on mentalization. So in order to recognize two people as interacting, you don't necessarily have to be thinking about their mental states. And this is consistent with increasing evidence that social interactions might actually be processed mainly visually. So what do I mean by that? So there's been several studies now showing that interacting dyads, like the one shown on the left, or pairs of bodies, are subject to a lot of behavioral effects of similar to other areas of visual processing. So they are subject to visual search. There's a visual search advantage for them. You see working memory advantages for them. They suffer from an inversion effect, so you're better at recognizing them when they're upright versus inverted, etc. However, one puzzle has been that even though there is behavioral and then other neural evidence that I haven't talked about suggesting that they're processed visually, most visual computational models, including state-of-the-art deep neural networks, are actually unable to recognize social interactions in images or videos. And this has been used as evidence that perhaps instead of this being a visual ability, recognizing social interactions might require some sort of explicit model of the social or physical world. So in other words, if I go back to this hill climbing example, that would suggest that perhaps in order to recognize this as a helping interaction, people are using an explicit model of these agents' goals and the physical world. And this theory is often modeled with a class of models called generative inverse planning models. Okay, so how these work is they say that perhaps people first extract the agents in a scene and then generate hypotheses about what those agents might be doing. So for example, maybe the red circle wants to go up the hill and the yellow triangle wants to help it. Or maybe the red circle is trying to go up the hill and the yellow triangle is hindering it, wants to hinder it. And then what these models do is they simulate possible trajectories for these different hypotheses, right? So if it was hypothesis 1, the motion would look like this. If it was hypothesis 2, the scene would play out like that. And both these hypotheses and the simulated trajectories are based on explicit knowledge of the world. And so in the case of these models, they often have a physics simulator in them that has some explicit physical knowledge and also explicit knowledge about agents' goals. And then these models compare the simulated trajectories for all the different hypotheses to the one that was actually on the screen. And whichever one matched best, they say that that's the scenario. So for example, in this case, it would predict health. All right. And so this is in contrast with the kind of more standard bottom-up visual model, like a deep learning, like most deep learning models, where you would just take the information from these two agents, and then they would go through a series of computations, but again, there would be no explicit model of agents, goals, or the physical world that's given to these models. It would just learns from a bunch of data to start making predictions. Okay, but like I said, puzzlingly, even though the second type of model is consistent with a bunch of recent behavioral and neural data, including our own, these models don't do well. Instead, it's the first type of model that gives state-of-the-art performance on these tasks. And so it's still sort of an open question which of these two different frameworks humans might use. Another thing, though, we know from our neuroimaging data is that recognizing social interactions is also dissociable from the processes for recognizing faces and motion of individual agents, suggesting that there's some sort of extra specialized representations maybe of a social interaction that the brain is computing. And one key property of interactions is that they're inherently relational, right? There's always at least two people in an interaction. And so perhaps if we imbue some of this knowledge into our models, into our visual models, they can start to do better. So we again ask the question, is purely visual information sufficient for making matching human social interaction judgments? And to test this, we developed a new visual model with relational inductive biases. And this is a project led by a graduate student in my lab, Manasi Malik, and there's a new preprint out, so I encourage you to go take a look. Okay, so what do I mean by an inductive bias? An inductive bias is an assumption that the learner uses to generalize to new situations. And inductive biases are thought to be a lot of the behind a lot of humans, the successes of human cognition, right? So we know that humans represent things in structured ways, right? Thinking about objects, agents, entities, and their relations. And these are often related to the concept of compositionality, which is thought to be, and these sorts of inductive biases are thought to be totally lacking in neural network models. They're often, sort of referred to as like de novo learners that start as a blank slate, which is very unhuman-like. But I don't think this is correct, right? A large part of neural network models' success is due to some key inductive biases, like the fact that they're convolutional and hierarchical, both of which are insights that are based on cognitive neuroscience and make assumptions about the spatial organization of the world. And so we wanted to see if we could add a new inductive bias specifically to capture this relational information. And we're going to do this by using graph structure. And so going back to that scene we saw before, there are these two agents. A standard neural network would extract information about each of them, for example, say their size, position, speed, etc., and feed it through multiple layers of processing, and over the course of a lot of training, make a prediction about whether you're watching helping or hindering. But this information isn't structured in any special way, and like I mentioned, it doesn't work very well. So you can instead represent these agents as nodes in a graph, and represent and learn information about their edges or connections between them. And so it can be a simple graph like this, or a more complex graph that has lots of agents and objects, and you can feed the information, the representations of these individual entities and their relations represented in a graph through the same kind of neural network to make a prediction. And this is called a graph neural network. What we did to try to recognize social interactions over the course of a video is we combine this graph neural network framework with a recurrent neural network that processes videos at different time steps to make a prediction about social interactions. And we called this model SocialGNN. So this is based on the success of many other recent graph neural networks, but this is the first graph net to predict social information directly from temporal, extended temporal events. All right, so to test the performance of our models, we use this data set from Josh Tenenbaum's lab at MIT called Phase. And so this consists of 500 animated videos of 2 agents shown here in red and green, and 2 objects in pink and blue. It has landmarks and walls that the agents can't travel towards, and so the videos follow some basic laws of physics. And there are 3 different types of interactions between these agents: friendly, neutral, or adversarial. So you can see this is an adversarial video where the 2 agents are fighting over the pink ball. And so what we try to do is use a graph representation to predict, or use our model to predict friendly versus neutral versus adversarial interactions. So the first thing we did was collected human ratings for all of these videos. So we showed people online these videos and described them to them. We told them that the red and green shapes are creatures, and the blue and pink balls are objects, and there are landmarks and walls, and creatures can't pass through walls, etc. We had them watch the videos and then rate them as adversarial, neutral, or friendly. And then our goal was to try to compare our model to human behavior. So to do that, we first had to extract the graphs from these models. So like I mentioned, the agents and objects are all represented as nodes in the graph. And so for each of the 4 entities, 2 agents, 2 objects, we input their position, velocity, angle, or heading angle, and size. And to build our graphs, what we did is we put edges between any entities that were touching each other. So in this case, the red agent is touching the blue object, which is also touching the green agent. So the input graph would have an undirected edge between the green and blue nodes and between the blue and red nodes. And importantly, all of this information can be extracted visually directly from the videos. The data set includes this information, so we put it in, but future work is trying to directly extract it from videos. And then this information is fed frame by frame into a graph neural network that takes the input and then learns updated graph representations at each time step and makes a final prediction. And we compared our graph neural network to 2 baseline models. The first is a standard visual recurrent neural network, which has the same structure and input features as our graph neural network model, but the features and processing are all done in a more standard way without the graph structure. And so all of the features that I just mentioned to you would be fed into an RNN, in particular an LSTM, and then at each time step, a learned representation, new representation is learned that is combined with the new video input from the next time frame, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the final time step, a linear classifier makes a prediction about whether the video is friendly, neutral, or adversarial. So the graph neural network, I'm not going to get into the technical details now, but it has the exact same structure as this recurrent neural network, except it represents not just all of the node information concatenated, but the information structured based on edges. They are also matched though in terms of parameter size, etc. And then the other model we compared to is the inverse planning model that was also released in the same paper as the data set, which has a similar structure like the one I walked through before. So it extracts agents, generates hypotheses, simulates trajectories, and then makes a prediction. And so this is the model from the Tenenbaum lab. Okay, so the first thing we did was try to, on this data set predict on different train test splits of the data set, predict whether the model was seeing a friendly, neutral, or adversarial interaction. And so I'm going to show you the results for each of our model and the two baseline models, two comparison models, as a function of percent correct. So chances would be 33%. Humans agree about 80% of the time. And so here's the inverse planning model. It does significantly better than the visual RNN. But in this test, our model, the graph neural network, does best and is actually at the level of human agreement. However, one interesting thing in this phase data set is that they had a held out set of challenging predictions. So all of the previous results I just showed you were done on held out data, but there are 100 videos that have totally novel scene and action types that the models will then have to generalize across. So this is a pretty tough test of generalization. And in this case, actually, the inverse planning model does do significantly better than our GNN model, but our GNN is still doing quite a bit better than the baseline model. And the inverse planning model's advantage comes at a computational cost. So both in terms of runtime and memory, the inverse planning model takes thousands of times more resources than either neural network model. Another big advantage of our model is that it can operate on natural videos. And so unlike the inverse planning model, which would need a full model of the physics of the world in a natural video, our model can be directly applied to extract graphs from videos. So we tested it on this gaze data set, which involves short interactions between different numbers of people and objects. And here we built graphs based not on contact, but on gaze direction. So we put an edge between two nodes if one person was looking at someone else. And so here, unlike before, the edges are directed. So the person in pink is looking at the person in blue, so there's a directed edge that way. The person in blue is looking at the brown object, so there's a directed edge down. All right, so we can compare the our model to the baseline visual RNN model. And so the visual RNN does slightly above chance, but actually it's not a balanced data set. So if you look at the confusion matrices, this model is purely just guessing. Contrast, our model does significantly better. It's still, got some ways to go, but we were pretty excited that the same model architecture could generalize just like humans can across these two very wildly different sets of stimuli. So we found that a purely visual model with this relational information can reproduce human social interaction judgments. And it can do so without explicit representations of agents' goals or the physics of the world, suggesting that maybe humans don't need to use that information all the time either. And instead, maybe structured relational visual information may be what humans use most of the time to recognize other people's social interactions. So I showed you that social interactions are, just to sum up, are selectively processed in the human STS separately from faces, voices, motion, theory of mind, etc. And these neural insights, along with other key concepts from cognitive science, directly inspired a new graph neural network model. And the findings from that suggest that maybe humans use structured visual computations to recognize interactions. In future work, we're hoping to directly compare these models to brain representations to gain a more complete picture of the neural computations. But zooming out for a second, I think that focusing more on real-world problems that go beyond recognizing single objects or faces is going to be critical for human scene and event understanding. And I think that these are areas where cognitive neuroscience can still meaningfully contribute to AI and machine learning. The The other thing I wanted to point out is that, going back to this example I started with, in order to understand what's happening, it's not enough just to understand that these people are all interacting, right, which was really the focus of my talk today. You actually need to know about agents' mental states and the physical world, right? And so these are key components to social scene understanding, and I think a lot of future work needs to be done to understand how these abilities interface with perhaps the more perceptual, visual aspects of scene understanding. So with that, I would like to thank my lab, especially Amy and Manasi, who led the 2 studies I talked about today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that amazing talk. I think I'm going to start taking some questions from the Q&A. So first, Shanae wanted to know, how did you separate social interaction from mental state inference from the dot video subjects for fMRI analysis? Also, for any of the people who ask questions, if I do not fully address your question, feel free to speak up. I can allow you to talk if you post in the Q&A.
Great question. How we did this is we had separate experiments for these. So we assumed that in these dot videos, people probably were not doing much mental state inference, or at least were doing equal amounts of it across the 2 conditions. And we contrasted this experiment for looking for social interaction selectivity to a separate one looking for regions that respond to theory of mind. So this was, we used the localizer experiment from Rebecca Sachs's lab, where people read stories that either, and answer questions that either have to do with somebody else's false belief or something that is something that's untrue in like a visual scene, a false photo, they call it. So those are 2 separate experiments. But what we can do then is we can localize with one set of data the social interaction region and the theory of mind region, and then in separate data say, does the social interaction region show a difference between the mental state conditions, and it doesn't, and same thing for the theory of mind and the social interaction.
Okay, great. I'm going to read out the next question. So have you looked at unique variances explained by social versus affective features?
We did not. There were a lot of models, and it gets a little complicated to keep running the variance partitioning analysis, because you have to build like a whole new encoding model for each one. But we did do an analysis that I didn't talk about, where we when we ran the full encoding model, you can look at each voxel's preferred feature. And the reason we decided not to look at the affective features is we actually didn't see any voxels whose either first or second preferred feature was valence and arousal. This could be for a lot of reasons. One being that like people don't agree very much on those ratings in the video, and so perhaps you really need individual subjects' ratings to get good measures of that in these videos. Or but it's also it's an interesting question that we can look at. We did not, unfortunately.
Okay, so are there controlled videos in testing the SocialGNN?
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by I wonder if I've ever asked this once to either expand in the Q&A or chat, or each video. So we had people yeah, I guess I'm not sure I know what you mean by control.
If you're still
videos without social interaction, great. Okay. Yes, so here there were, well, sort of. So in the first shape data set, in this data set, there were friendly and adversarial videos, which both had social interactions, and then neutral videos, which could mean no social interaction or could mean just like a neutral interaction. For this data set, we did not go through and ask people if they thought neutral meant no social interaction or something else. But it's an interesting question that we've thought about doing. But I think for the most part, the neutral interactions are when the two shapes are acting separately with each of their objects. For the natural videos, we had an equal number of, I didn't get into all the details, but there were 5 different types of social interactions, and then a pretty good number of scenes without, rated as being non-communicative or having no interaction. And so the results I'm showing here were the model's performance in distinguishing between scenes with a scene of social interaction versus scenes without. The model can also tell apart the 5 different social interactions above chance.
Cool. So Ilker wanted to know, which I also was going to ask if nobody else asked, is the SocialGNN trained once, say on the phase data set, and tested on both the gaze and the phase data sets, or was it trained separately for each data set? Thank you again for the great talk.
Oh, thank you. It was trained separately. We've thought a little bit about, I mean, ideally you would just train maybe on natural videos and then like fine tune it on the animated shapes. The data sets were different enough that we decided not to pursue that too much, but I think that's a really interesting direction. And I think that if there was more alignment between the data sets, because the model does extract away from the very low level visual cues, I think that could work, but we didn't test it directly.
All right. Which layer of GNN or RNN does the social interaction information being detected? For example, in late layer of GNN or early layer of RNN?
That's an interesting question. I don't think we did much to look at predictions from different layers. For both the GNN and RNN, we just, there's a linear layer on top of the final state output. It would be interesting to look at different layers for each of them, but we haven't yet. And one reason we didn't is because the videos evolve temporally at different rates. So sometimes it's really obvious in the first couple seconds what the interaction is, but sometimes you need like a full 10 seconds. So it's a little tricky to compare on this data set. Good question.
How much do you think the social interaction region in STS depends on dynamic displays? Do you think the region would preferentially respond to static displays or social interactions like those studied by Pompeo and Hathaway?
Good question. I think it has much stronger responses to dynamic interactions. I think it would probably respond more to static, and I think others have looked at this. Cami Coldwin has a recent paper on this, so I think it responds more to static interactions than static non-interactions, but it responds more to dynamic stimuli.
Last couple of questions here, so if anybody has any more questions, feel free to keep adding them to the chat and we'll try to get through as many we can. So Brian says, you talked about how some of these results suggest that rich high-level physical understanding may not be required for recognizing some of these social interactions. But in the same spirit as asking about how vision might extract social information, maybe vision might also be extracting simple aspects of intuitive physics, which could then still be playing a mediating role in your graph neural network model. Such cool work.
Thank you. Yeah, great question, and I agree, and I imagine that is happening because I don't think these scenarios would make sense with no information about physics, right? So I think there must be some physical information that the model is learning from the visual input. That's a good question.
And our last question is, did you weight the edges of the graph differently?
Okay. So not in their input. So the input, there's no, not in the input. The learned output, so no, not when we input them. You could imagine doing that instead of like a binary, like sender receiver edge. You could imagine like doing something based on proximity, like if two people are kind of close or kind of looking at each other versus directly looking at each other, you could weight the edges. And we thought about that a little bit, but we haven't tried it. It's an interesting idea.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions. So Adam and I just posted in the chat the link to the trainee Q&A. Everybody should feel free to join us there.
Recording stopped.
Going to be a more casual conversation beginning at 3:30. So thank you so much, everybody.